It was Lord Peter Wimsey's misfortune, if one may call it that, to be in the wrong place with exactly the right attention at 11:30 on a Thursday morning, when England was in that peculiar state of damp propriety, which makes a man feel both virtuous and vaguely conspiratorial for carrying an umbrella. He had gone into St. Olave's, Pimlico, not from piety. His theology, like his ties, tended to be worn chiefly on formal occasions. But because Bunter had developed a conscientious interest in ecclesiastical needlework and had heard, through channels both mysterious and impeccably respectable, that St. Olave's possessed an altar frontal of a particularly sound 16th-century stitch, Wimsey, who could never resist the combination of a specialist's enthusiasm and a piece of workmanship, had consented to look at it, and, soon having consented, found himself lingering in the north aisle with an air of detached scholarship while the verger droned softly about benefactions and the lamentable modern tendency to treat the house of God as a shortcut. It was while the verger was in mid-sentence, and if you'll just step this way, my lord, you can observe the misericords, which are very curious indeed, that the disturbance began. At first it was merely a sound, a muffled clatter, as of something wooden striking stone, followed by a pause so complete that it made the ear lean forward. Then came a thin little cry. No operatic shriek, but a strangled exclamation, the kind respectable people make when they have tripped over a cat in the dark and are too well bred to blame the cat aloud. The verger stopped. His mouth remained politely open. It was as though he had been interrupted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Wimsey, who had been looking at a brass memorial and mentally correcting its Latin, the deceased had been Fidelis Conjux to a man she had outlived by 19 years. Fidelis, indeed, turned his head slightly. "Sound carries beastly in churches," he remarked conversationally, as though commenting on acoustics were the natural response to any impending catastrophe. The verger, recovering himself with the defensiveness of minor office, said, "There's always a bit of noise about. Workmen. The White House lot, you know." "The White House?" said Wimsey, because something in the verger's tone suggested that this was not the White House, which occasionally featured in foreign newspapers, but some local institution whose existence was taken for granted and whose moral character was not. "The parish rooms," said the verger, jerking his thumb toward a door in the south transept. An unassuming piece of oak with a brass handle rubbed bright by the fingers of the pious. "They call it the White House on account of the paint. Mrs. Garrett runs it, soup kitchen and teas and such for the poor, when she's not running meetings. There's a committee." "A committee," said Wimsey, with gentle relish, as though tasting a familiar bitterness. "Committees are so comforting. One always knows in advance precisely how little will be done, and at what expense to everyone's temper." The verger gave him a quick, startled glance. But before he could decide whether this was blasphemy or merely the peculiar humor of the upper classes, the door in question opened abruptly. A young woman came out, no longer young enough to be called a girl without impertinence, but with the still unsettled expression of youth in crisis. She had a thin face and a mouth that looked as though it had practiced tightness. Her hat was on crooked. Her gloved hands were empty, and the fact that they were empty was peculiar, because they were held in front of her as if they ought to have been carrying something. She saw them and attempted instantly to arrange her features into the public mask of normality, but the attempt was like smoothing rumpled paper. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Mr. Her eyes flicked to the verger. "Mr. Pottle, there's been an accident." The verger's expression became that of a man to whom accidents were administrative annoyances. "What sort of accident?" "Miss Tibbet," he demanded. The young woman swallowed. "In the kitchen. Father Dimble says we're to fetch Dr. Lancaster. It's Mr. Bellingham." "What? Not Mr. Bellingham?" said the verger, and his tone had the peculiar shock of the English when the calamity touches property. "Not the treasurer?" Wimsey looked at her empty hands again. "Dropped something on his foot?" he suggested lightly. "No," she said, and at last the effort of decency failed her. No, he's dead. The pause that followed was so complete that one could hear, somewhere in the church, a latecomer kneeling with an exaggerated squeak of leather on stone. The verger said slowly, "Dead?" "Yes." She drew in a breath that made a small sound, like paper tearing. Father Dimble said, he said not to let anyone come in, not yet. He said what? Asked Whimsy, still mild. She looked at him, taking him in, his neatly irreverent face, the monocle that suggested, to people who did not know, a decorative affectation rather than an instrument of observation, and the air of being amused by the world as though it were a performance laid on for his private entertainment. He said we mustn't. "Make a fuss," she said, and then, as though suddenly ashamed of the phrase, added quickly, "Not until Mrs. Garrett's told, and the police. He said we ought to be careful." "Careful," repeated Whimsy. "Yes, because of the children." "The children," said Whimsy, and the verger made a small impatient noise, like a horse stamping. "There's always children," he said, as though this were the chief defect of charity. Lord knows why they can't keep out of places where they're not wanted." Miss Tibbet stared at him with the bleak hostility of a conscientious person forced into an emergency. "It's not like that," she said. "The mothers bring them, and the club meets in the big room. If word got out—" "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "if word got out." He took a step toward the door, and the verger, suddenly remembering hierarchy, scuttled alongside him. "My lord," he began anxiously, this is not. If there's been an unfortunate occurrence, the proper thing is to send for the police and let them—" "Of course," said Whimsy cheerfully. We will do everything in the correct order, because England would crumble into the sea if we did not. But while we're waiting for the correct people to arrive, it's generally wise to prevent the incorrect people from tidying up." Miss Tibbet made a little sound. "Nobody's tidying," she said. Whimsy gave her a glance of such genial sympathy that it almost looked like ordinary kindness. "Oh, my dear," he said, "everybody tidies. They tidy out of terror, they tidy out of decency, they tidy because someone has always told them that mess is wicked. They tidy because it gives their hands something to do while their minds are trying not to see what they have seen." He turned the brass handle of the door. It was warm. The verger fumbled for a key and then realized, too late, that the door was not locked. That, too, was a fact. Beyond it lay a corridor painted cream, recently and not carefully, leading to a room where the smell of boiled cabbage wrestled, with losing gallantry, odd against disinfectant and damp. Somewhere a kettle was hissing, as though persevering with domestic duty in spite of tragedy. "Kitchen's through there," said Miss Tibbet, and her voice now had that slightly brisk note people adopt when they're about to face something dreadful and want to get it over with before their courage changes its mind. Whimsy went first, because he had the advantage of being able to pretend he was curious rather than afraid. The kitchen door stood half open. On the floor just inside it lay a wooden tray, one of those institutional objects that have never known anything but service and are therefore more pathetic than any ornament. A mug had rolled away and lay on its side, a thin line of tea leaking from it like a slow accusation. On the far side of the room, by the sink, sat a man in shirt sleeves. At his back against the tiled wall, his legs stretched out at an angle that suggested an attempt at comfort. His head lolled slightly, and one eye, only one, was open, staring with a detached astonishment at the ceiling. His mouth was half-parted, as though he had been about to deliver an earnest remark on parish accounts and had been interrupted mid-breath. At his feet, very neatly arranged, lay a bundle of papers clipped together. A pencil had been placed beside them, parallel to the edge of the bundle, as though someone had thought, "Let us at least keep the stationery in order." Father Dimble was kneeling by the body. He was a short, muscular man with the kind of face one associates with brisk sermons and committee meetings, ruddy, determined, and slightly flurried at the edges. He looked up when they entered, and his expression was that of a man caught in the act of being human. "Thank God," he said, and then, seeing Whimsy, added with the automatic politeness of the church, "My lord." Whimsy inclined his head. "Hello, Padre. Awfully sorry to find you running a mortuary." Father Dimble wiped his hands on his handkerchief with unnecessary vigor. "It's Mr. Bellingham," he said. "He came in to go over the accounts. He always did the accounts on Thursdays. Miss Tibbet was making tea and Mrs. Garrett had gone to fetch bread. I was in the office. I heard a sound. When I came in, he was like this." "Was he alive?" asked Whimsy. Father Dimble hesitated. For a moment, he looked at me. He tried to speak. Then, he made a gesture of finality that was more eloquent than theology. Whimsy glanced at the papers, the pencil, the spilled tea, the tray. "So, and you sent for the doctor?" he said. "Yes, and—" Father Dimble's eyes slid, despite himself, toward the kitchen window. It was high up, frosted glass, half open on a catch. "I meant to send for the police at once, of course. But there are considerations." "The children," said Whimsy. Father Dimble's jaw tightened. "Yes, and the women. The whole work here depends on trust. If it becomes known that a man died, here, people will talk. You know what people are." "Sadly," said Whimsy, "I do. They will say it was disgraceful, or that it was a judgment, or that it was improper to have men alone with kettles, and somebody will use it as an argument against giving soup to the poor, which is an old English pastime." Father Dimble stared at him as though unsure whether this was sympathy or mockery. It was both, though in the peculiar way of Whimsy. "My lord," he said stiffly, "there is nothing improper in our work." "Never suggested there was," said Whimsy, and then added, looking down at the dead man's open eye, "but there may be something improper in his death." The verger made a sound of protest. "My lord, surely—" "Pottle," said Whimsy mildly, "when a man drops dead in a kitchen with his accounts neatly stacked beside him, it's either the act of God or the act of someone who wants it to look like God did it." Miss Tibbet, who had been standing very straight with her hands clasped, suddenly said in a thin rush, "He wasn't like himself." Whimsy looked at her. "How so?" He was cross," she said. "Not cross exactly. He was sharp. He asked me if Mrs. Garrett had been using the funds for things. And then he laughed, but it wasn't nice laughter. And then he said Father Dimble would be sorry if the papers ever got hold of it. I didn't understand. I thought it was just committee talk." Father Dimble went a shade paler under the ruddiness. "Miss Tibbet," he said warningly. She flushed. "I'm not saying anything wrong. It's true." Whimsy held up a hand. No. This is precisely the sort of nothing at all that ends by being everything. Tell me, did he drink the tea?" "Yes," she said. "He had one mouthful, then he stood up, as though he meant to go to the office, and then he stumbled. He knocked the tray, and he sat down very carefully, as though he meant to rest, and then—" Her voice failed her. Whimsy's gaze traveled idly around the kitchen. There was nothing remarkable. A row of mugs, a tin of cocoa, a battered teapot, a loaf knife, a wooden chair with one leg mended, a notice pinned to the wall about hand washing. On the table lay a folded newspaper, its headline half visible. Something about scandals and ministers and the grim amusements of politics. On the draining board, beside the sink, stood a white jug with a blue rim. It had a hairline crack in the glaze, and someone, meticulously, lovingly, had tied a piece of string around it, as though to stop it falling apart by sheer force of domestic optimism. "Charming jug," said Whimsy. Father Dimble blinked. "What?" Whimsy smiled apologetically. "Sorry, my mind is like a magpie in a china shop. It seizes on irrelevant objects when it ought to be thinking holy thoughts. He took a step closer to the body. Not too close. He had never enjoyed the physical intimacy of death, though he had known too much of it. "May I?" he said to Father Dimble. And without waiting for permission, he stooped and looked at Mr. Bellingham's hands. They were clean, the nails trimmed. A treasurer's hands, hands that shuffle papers and sign checks and disapprove of extravagance. But on the right forefinger, near the knuckle, there was a faint grey smear, as of graphite. Whimsy straightened. "He was writing," he said, almost to himself. "Yes," said Father Dimble. "He always wrote. He made notes about everything." "Did anyone move the papers?" Whimsy asked, still lightly. "No," said Miss Tibbet quickly, too quickly. "No, of course not." Whimsy's eyes met hers. He did not accuse. He merely observed. "Then why is the pencil placed so nicely beside them?" he asked. Miss Tibbet's face went scarlet. She stammered. "I didn't mean... I only thought he'd like it. It looked untidy." Whimsy nodded, yes, as though she had told him she had watered a plant. "Thank you," he said. "That is exactly what I meant about tidying." Father Dimble opened his mouth, perhaps to rebuke her, perhaps to defend her, but at that moment, from the corridor beyond, came the sound of brisk footsteps and the rustle of skirts. Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with the brisk, capable air of one who has spent her life organizing other people's inadequacies into something resembling a working system. Her face was handsome in a hard way, and her hair was the color of iron filings. She carried a basket with bread in it, and the bread looked absurdly innocent. She took in the scene in one glance. The body, Father Dimble kneeling, Miss Tibbet white and rigid, Whimsy with his hands in his pockets like a man contemplating a painting. For a second, nothing moved. Then Mrs. Garrett said very calmly, "Who has sent for the police?" Father Dimble began, "My dear Mrs. Garrett." Whimsy answered instead, as though the question were addressed to him personally. "Nobody yet," he said, "but somebody has been thinking about not sending for them." Mrs. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" she asked. "Lord Peter Whimsy," he said, and bowed slightly. "At your service, madam, in all matters involving unpleasantness and the human soul." Mrs. Garrett looked him up and down with the cold appraisal of a woman who had never been impressed by titles when there were budgets to balance. "Then you will kindly go away," she said. "This is parish business." Whimsy's smile did not alter, but his tone changed, a fraction less airy. "It stopped being parish business," he said gently, "when Mr. Bellingham stopped being alive." Mrs. Garrett's jaw tightened. She took one step into the room and set the bread down on the table with precision, as though bread were something that must not be contaminated by disorder. She looked at the dead man, and for the first time her composure cracked, but only in the smallest of ways. Her hand, reaching out, stopped short, as if afraid of touching what she had helped to create. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Mr. Bellingham." Then she lifted her head and looked straight at Father Dimble. "This," she said very quietly, "must not get out." Whimsy, watching her, made a soft sound, half laughter, half sigh. "Ah," he said, "now we come to it." "The cover-up," said Mrs. Garrett, her voice flat. "No," said Whimsy. "The reason for it." She stared at him. "What do you mean?" Whimsy turned his head toward the corridor as though listening. From somewhere beyond came the faint sound of children's voices, thin, cheerful, untroubled, singing something tuneless with great conviction. A club meeting, perhaps, or merely the inevitable noise of life pressing against tragedy's locked door. Whimsy's eyes returned to Mrs. Garrett. "I mean," he said very softly, "that people don't usually conceal a natural death unless they're concealing something else as well." Mrs. Garrett's face went still. In that stillness there was the faintest shadow of something. Not fear, exactly, but calculation. "What do you know?" she demanded. Whimsy's smile came back, almost boyishly. "Not nearly enough," he said. But I should like very much to know what the White House knew, and when it knew it." At that moment, as if on cue, the bell of St. Olave's began to toll for midday, measured solemn strokes that filled the little corridor and pressed into the kitchen like a slow, inexorable accusation. It made the teacups spill shine briefly, like blood seen under cold light. Whimsy listened and murmured as though to himself, "Time, gentlemen, please." And nobody in that kitchen, not even Mrs. Garrett, could quite have said whether he meant the church bell, the dead man's last minutes, or the narrow margin in which truth can be prevented from becoming public knowledge. The door behind them creaked faintly, as though someone outside had leaned against it to listen. Whimsy did not turn his head, but his eyes, which had been idle and amused, sharpened with sudden interest, like a man who has just heard, beneath the respectable sounds of a parish at noon, the small, telltale click of a lock being tested. The bell went on with its patient, admonitory bon, 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 and the children beyond the corridor answered it with a shrill irreverence which, being natural, was almost indecent. Mrs. Garrett moved first. She lifted the bread basket again, as though it might serve as a shield, and said very distinctly, "Father Dimble, you will go at once and speak to Mrs. Munn in the club-room. Tell her there has been an interruption, and that the children must be taken round to the schoolyard by the back way. No one is to come along this passage." "I can't send them out into the wet," Father Dimble protested, automatically humane. "So you can send them out into the wet sooner than you can send them into this," she replied, and there was the hint of steel under the parish propriety. "Go." He went, because she had the voice of the sort of woman who keeps lists. Whimsy watched him depart, then turned politely to Miss Tibbet, who had the stricken look of a person whose conscience was running ahead of her body. "And you, Miss Tibbet, was it? Would you mind doing something that will feel utterly useless and therefore highly consoling? Make another pot of tea. Strong, and don't touch anything else. Not cups, not spoons, not the sugar. Merely boil the kettle and stand there like a guardian angel with scalds." Miss Tibbet blinked. "But tea," said Whimsy, with gentle finality, "is England's substitute for courage." She moved toward the kettle as though to a sacrament. Mrs. Garrett's eyes stayed on Whimsy. "You speak as if you have authority here." "Not authority," said Whimsy, "only a certain experience of people doing frantic, irreparable things in the first half-hour after a death. If you prefer, I will take myself off and leave you to tidy the corpse and lock the papers in the safe." The color rose in her cheekbones. "There is no safe." "Pity," said Whimsy. "They do wonders for the conscience." She drew a breath. "Mr. Bellingham was a good man." "Oh, I dare say," said Whimsy, and his tone was so perfectly agreeable that it was hard to accuse him of insolence. "Good men die in kitchens every day, usually of kidneys. The question is whether Mr. Bellingham died of kidneys or of something more pointed." Mrs. Garrett's glance flicked involuntarily to the bread basket, and Whimsy noted it with the mild interest of a cat noticing a mouse hole. "You were fond of him," he observed. "I respected him," she said sharply. "He kept this place from becoming slack. There are always those who would like to treat funds as elastic." "And he accused you," said Whimsy, as if continuing a previous conversation about parish flower arranging, "of using them for things, according to Miss Tibbet." Mrs. Garrett's mouth tightened. "Miss Tibbet repeats committee talk without understanding it." "Committee talk is commonly the purest form of malice," said Whimsy, "because it is always phrased as concern." A faint sound came from the corridor again, less innocent this time. A shuffle, a pause, the discreet retreat of a shoe that has trodden on a loose board. Whimsy's eyes went, without turning his head. eye to the half-open kitchen door. He spoke a trifle louder. "Your White House, Mrs. Garrett. Who has keys to these rooms?" "Father Dimble, myself, the verger, and Mrs. Munn when she is arranging for the Mothers' Union." "Why?" "Because someone," said Whimsy pleasantly, "is listening." Mrs. Garrett stiffened. "Nonsense." He raised his voice, as one might in a drawing-room when one knows Aunt Agatha is eavesdropping behind the curtains. "If you will come in, whoever you are," said Whimsy, "you will be spared the strain of imagining worse." There was a moment's paralysis. Then, quite slowly, the door widened another inch, and a man appeared. Thin, pallid, wearing a raincoat that was too large, as though borrowed from a better-fed friend. His hair was plastered down in a way that suggested either vanity or an attempt to look respectable, while he smiled with the timidity of one who has practiced smiles in mirrors. "Beg pardon," he said. "I didn't mean, only I heard." Mrs. Garrett's nostrils flared. "Mr. Craven, what are you doing here?" The man's smile wavered. "I was on the list for the soup. Thought I'd come early. It's cold out." "It is not soup hour," said Mrs. Garrett. "No, ma'am," said Mr. Craven, with an air of being perpetually corrected by life. His eyes slid past her shoulder and caught the dead man's open stare. The smile collapsed. "Oh, Lord." He took a step backward. Whimsy intervened lightly, as though to catch a teacup before it fell. "Steady, old chap," he said. "Nobody blames you for having eyes. But we do blame people for having tongues. Be a good fellow and wait in the corridor until Father Dimble tells you what you may do with yourself." Mr. Craven swallowed. "Is he murdered?" Mrs. Garrett snapped. "Don't be melodramatic." Whimsy said, "That depends on what you mean by melodrama. If you mean a man falling dead after a mouthful of tea, then yes, it is. Now, corridor." Mr. Craven retreated, dazedly obedient. Miss Tibbet, at the kettle, whispered, "Poison?" Whimsy looked at her. "Perhaps, or perhaps not. The trouble with poison is that people of your class think it always comes in little bottles marked skull and crossbones, and people of mine think it always comes in inherited scandals and French novels. In practice, it tends to come in the sugar basin." Miss Tibbet's glance darted to the sugar. Her hand hovered, then snatched back as though burned. Mrs. Garrett's composure, admirable but not infinite, gave one small crack. "My lord, what do you want?" Whimsy stooped, very delicately, and took up the pencil by its unsharpened end, as though it were a relic. He set it down again exactly where it had been, parallel, tidy, damning. "I want," he said softly, "to know what Mr. Bellingham was writing when he died, and why somebody in this building is more frightened of the newspapers than of the police." He glanced at the frosted, half-open window. The catch sat oddly, as if it had been forced and then adjusted to look casual. A thread of cold air worried the steam above the kettle and made it drift, briefly, toward the body like a ghost that had lost its way. "And I want," he added, still conversational, "to know why your window has been left to pretend it was shut." Mrs. Garrett stared at it, and for the first time her eyes looked uncertain. "I always leave it like that," she said. "For the smell." Whimsy nodded. "Naturally, as only smells have a way of escaping even through closed windows." In the corridor, Father Dimble's voice rose, hasty, persuasive, followed by the scrape of chairs and the sudden hush of children being told, in that urgent tone, that they are to be good at once. Whimsy listened, and his face took on that slightly absent look people assume when making private calculations. Then he said, lightly, as though changing the subject to theology, "Tell me, Mrs. Garrett, how long has Mr. Bellingham been treasurer?" 7 years, she said. "And in all that time," he went on, "has he ever dropped dead before?" She flinched. "No." "Then," said Whimsy, Let us begin by assuming he did not choose today as a novelty. He moved to the table, not touching, merely reading with his eyes. And the folded newspaper's headline was now fully visible. Something about a question in the House and ministerial denials. He smiled faintly. The House, he murmured. White houses, houses of God, houses of Commons, everywhere people denying things. Mrs. Garrett said hoarsely, "It has nothing to do with Parliament." Whimsy's gaze lifted to hers, suddenly direct. "That," he said, "is precisely what I intend to find out." Mrs. Garrett's last words hung in the air with the bell's lingering vibration, and Whimsy, having planted that particular barb with the delicacy of a man arranging flowers on a grave, seemed content to let it draw its own poison. "You are perfectly right," he said. "We will not discuss Parliament. We will discuss tea." Miss Tibbet made a small, helpless movement toward the cups, remembered his injunction, and arrested her hands in midair like a child caught filching jam. Whimsy leaned slightly toward the table, not touching. "What brand of tea is this?" Mrs. Garrett stared. "Indian, from Lyons. Why does that matter?" "It matters," said Whimsy, "because a thing that looks like an accident is very often merely a habit with one new ingredient. Habits are always the murderer's accomplices." He looked over at the sink, at the cracked jug with its absurd string. "And the milk?" "Condensed," said Miss Tibbet quickly. "We have it for the children. It keeps." Whimsy nodded, as though the keeping quality of milk were an ethical matter. "And sugar comes from where?" Mrs. Garrett said, "From the tin, like sugar does." "There are sugars," said Whimsy, "that come from tins, and sugars that come from pockets." She made an impatient gesture. This is ridiculous. If you suspect, then ring the police and have done with it." "In due time," said Whimsy, and smiled as though he were agreeing to a dance. "But first, let us not spoil the evidence out of sheer obedience to procedure. Father Dimble has, by moving no more than a nervous handkerchief, already done better than most." He stepped very gently around the dead man. His shoes made no sound on the worn linoleum. He paused by Mr. Bellingham's neatly arranged papers and read their headings upside down with the practiced ease of a scholar who has translated worse handwriting in worse light. A list, columns, figures, and at the top, in a bolder hand, St. Olave's White House, disbursements. Under it, items that were not remarkable in themselves: coal, bread, jam, rent, until one line, halfway down, it caught the eye by being too vague. Special disbursement. Private. Whimsy's eyebrow rose a fraction. He did not point. He did not even look as though he had read it. He merely said, conversationally, "Do you keep 2 sets of books, Mrs. Garrett?" The question was put with the airy politeness of a man asking whether one preferred claret or burgundy, and yet it made Miss Tibbet catch her breath. Mrs. Garrett did not blink. "Of course not." "Excellent," said Whimsy. "Then we may assume Mr. Bellingham was about to accuse someone unjustly, which would be unlike him, I gather." "He was," said Father Dimble's voice from the corridor, coming nearer. "Unbending, but not unjust." He entered, rain-dark at the shoulders, and shut the door behind him with an ostentatious care that told Whimsy 2 things at once: that the children had been diverted, and that the priest wished, desperately, to pretend the world outside could be shut out as easily as a draft. "I've sent them out," Father Dimble said. "Mrs. Munn is taking them to the schoolyard. They will think it an adventure." "And Mr. Craven?" asked Whimsy. "In the vestry," said Father Dimble reluctantly. "He insisted he must say a prayer." Whimsy murmured, "People are so pious when they are frightened." Mrs. Garrett said sharply, "He will talk." "Perhaps," said Whimsy, "but he will talk more if he is shooed like a dog. Terror has a way of becoming loquacious when it is insulted." He drifted toward the frosted window again. The catch still sat wrong. He raised his hand, not to touch the latch, but to feel the air. "There is a draught," he observed. "There always is," Mrs. Garrett replied. "Yes," said Whimsy mildly. "Now, but there is also a difference between a draught and a purpose." Father Dimble's eyes followed his gaze. "My lord, what are you suggesting?" "That someone may have wished," said Whimsy, "to remove a smell." Miss Tibbet whispered, "Smell?" Whimsy turned his head and looked at her with a kind of sympathetic irony. "My dear lady, poison is so vulgar when it announces itself. It prefers to be quiet. But bodies are less discreet. If a man died here and was left for any time, say half an hour, one might begin to fear the kitchen would cease to be fit for ladies and soup. Then one might open a window. One might even open it after remembering it ought not to have been opened." Mrs. Garrett said very low, "Are you accusing us of moving him?" "No," said Whimsy. "Not yet. And I'm merely pointing out that your anxiety about not making a fuss has already made a fuss with the facts." He let his attention drift back to the spilled tea. The thin brown line had crept under the table leg and dried at the edges. Whimsy's gaze fixed on the shape of the puddle, and his voice became idler, as though he were describing clouds. "Miss Tibbet, when the tray fell, where were you standing?" "Here," she said at once, pointing to a spot near the stove. "I was about to pour. And Mr. Bellingham was where?" "By the table. He had the papers. He'd just sat down." "And he took a mouthful," said Whimsy, "and rose. Did he carry the mug?" "No," she said. "He left it on the tray. Then he went as if to the office and stumbled." Whimsy nodded, and his tone was still perfectly mild, but something in it tightened like a string being drawn. "Then," he said, "the mug should be nearer the table, not here by the doorway." Miss Tibbet stared at the overturned mug by the threshold. "It rolled." "Cups roll," said Whimsy, "in particular ways. They have habits too." Mrs. Garrett said briskly, "This is absurd. You are making a geometry lesson out of a tragedy." Whimsy smiled. "Tragedy," he said, "is merely geometry with blood in it." Father Dimble said, "My lord, the doctor will be here presently. Surely we should." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "and the police. But before they arrive, I should like one small experiment that will cost nobody's reputation and may cost somebody's liberty." Mrs. Garrett stiffened. "What experiment?" Whimsy pointed to the wooden tray. "Miss Tibbet, you will take up the tray exactly as you held it. Do not touch the mug. Leave it where it lies. Merely hold the tray and stand as you stood when you entered the kitchen." Miss Tibbet's hands shook, but she obeyed. She lifted the tray, carefully, reverently, as though it were a communion plate, and stood near the stove. "Now," said Whimsy, "walk as you walked." She took 2 steps toward the table. "Stop," said Whimsy. He crossed, rapidly now, and stood where Mr. Bellingham must have stood, near the table edge. He looked down at the floor between them. "If the tray fell when he struck it," he said, "it would fall here, not there." "Unless what?" demanded Mrs. Garrett. Whimsy's eyes lifted to her face, and his expression was suddenly less amused. "Unless," he said softly. "Now the tray fell earlier than you think, or later than you say." There was a brief silence in which the hissing kettle sounded like an accusation being sharpened. Miss Tibbet said in a small voice, "I told the truth." "I believe you," Whimsy replied gently, "which makes it much more interesting." Father Dimble said hoarsely, "Then someone else." "Someone else," said Whimsy, "has been arranging this kitchen as neatly as that pencil. And the peculiar thing about arrangements is that they always reflect the arranger's mind." Mrs. Garrett's composure finally showed a hairline crack. "My lord, what do you think happened?" Whimsy glanced down at Mr. Bellingham's open eye, then at the papers, Then, briefly, at the string-tied jug. "I think," he said, "that Mr. Bellingham came to audit more than accounts. I think he frightened someone who is usually very good at appearing respectable. And I think your cover-up is not to protect charity from scandal, but to protect someone from the consequence of a private disbursement." He stepped back, hands in pockets again, and his tone floated upward into irony, as if he had not just said something dreadful. "And now," he added, "let us ring up the police before the White House begins to imagine it can handle death by committee." The police arrived with that air of weary punctuality which suggests that crime, like the milk round, is an institution to be endured rather than a moral outrage to be contemplated. The first man through the door was Inspector Parker, Charles Parker of Scotland Yard. Tall, competent, and suffering faintly in advance, as a man suffers when he sees, at the end of a long day, the familiar figure of a friend who is also a complication. "Peter," he said, taking in the kitchen in one glance. Mr. Bellingham's unnatural posture, the spilt tea, the women with faces like badly hung curtains. "What are you doing here?" "Being useful," said Whimsy. "Or at least ornamental. One must justify one's existence somehow, and I find murder an excellent stimulus." Parker's mouth twitched, but his eyes were already at work. Behind him came a uniformed constable, making careful notes on a pad, and Dr. Lankster, who was the parish's medical conscience incarnate. A spare man with a kind face grown hard by too much human frailty. "Move nobody," Parker snapped, and then, seeing Father Dimble's offended dignity, "Not you, sir. Don't disturb the room." "As if we haven't been trying not to," said Mrs. Garrett sharply. Parker's gaze touched her and slid away again. He had the knack, acquired in police work, of seeming to look at nothing while missing very little. "Right," he said. "Doctor." Dr. Lankster knelt. There was a small rustle as he opened his bag, and then the professional silence of a man listening to a body that no longer answered. Whimsy watched him with the detached attention of one who has listened to too many hearts stop. After a moment, Lancaster stood. "Dead," he said unnecessarily. "Not more than an hour, perhaps less." Parker nodded. "Cause?" Lancaster hesitated, and his hand, habitively, touched his mouth as if to keep words from escaping too freely. "No obvious injury," he said. "There's a slight froth at the lips. Pupils. Fixed. It could be. Heart. It could be. Something taken." "Taken," repeated Parker. Mrs. Garrett said swiftly, "Sir, he had tea." Whimsy murmured, "Tea is always the first suspect in England." Parker shot him a look. "Don't be funny, Peter." "I'm never funny on purpose," said Whimsy. "It just happens." Parker turned to Miss Tibbet, whose hands were now clasped so tightly that the gloves creaked. "You made the tea?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "Did anyone else handle it?" "No. Mrs. Garrett was out. Father Dimble was in the office. Mr. Bellingham came in. He sat, he spoke, he drank. Then he—" Her voice broke. Mrs. Garrett said, "It was an accident, natural causes. There is no need for drama." Parker looked at her, more directly now. Natural causes don't usually lead to people barricading children in a club room and asking strangers not to make a fuss. Father Dimble flushed. "Inspector, our concern was for the work here." "So the people are quick to gossip, and quicker still to invent," said Parker, "which is why we're here." Whimsy, who had been gazing at the list of disbursements with a faint air of academic interest, said lightly, "I believe you will find Mr. Bellingham was concerned with gossip too, in a way. He appears to have been auditing a special disbursement." Parker's eyes flicked to the papers. He did not touch them. "What papers are these?" "The accounts," said Mrs. Garrett. Parker said, "Are they his?" "Yes," said Father Dimble. "And this pencil?" Parker asked. Miss Tibbet went crimson. Put it straight." Parker's expression did not change, but one felt the small inward click of a policeman making a mental note. "Right," he said. "Nobody touches anything else. Constable, tape the corridor and keep anyone out. Doctor, can you tell me, poison? If so, what sort?" "I can't swear," said Lankster. "But the froth, his stomach may tell us more. We'll need the post-mortem." Mrs. Garrett made a sharp little sound of protest, as though the notion of a post-mortem were indecent. Whimsy's voice was mild. "It's rather like balancing the books, Mrs. Garrett. One must see what has gone in and what has come out." Her eyes flashed at him. "We are not criminals." "No," said Whimsy, "but someone may be." Parker moved to the window. He examined the catch without touching it, his head slightly on one side like a bird listening. "This has been meddled with." Mrs. Garrett said at once, "We leave it that way. For the smell." Whimsy murmured, "The smell again." Parker turned. "What smell?" Father Dimble said stiffly. "Soup, Inspector. This is a kitchen." Parker's gaze went briefly to the string-tied jug. "And that," Mrs. Garrett said. "Milk jug. Old. It leaks." Whimsy's eyes met Parker's for a fraction of a second. It was one of those looks men exchange when they have silently agreed to distrust a perfectly ordinary object. Parker said, "Who else was in the building?" Mrs. Garrett's lips tightened. "No one." Whimsy said softly, "Mr. Craven was listening outside the door." Miss Tibbet exclaimed, "Oh!" Parker's head snapped. "Who?" "A man on the soup list," said Whimsy. "Thin, raincoat, nervous smile, a devotional interest in other people's tragedies." Parker swore softly. "Where is he now?" "In the vestry," said Father Dimble. "Praying." Parker said, "Constable, bring him here." "Gently." The constable went. Parker's attention returned to the body. He squatted, then peering at Mr. Bellingham's hands, and Whimsy saw him notice the grey smear on the forefinger. "He'd been writing," Parker said. "Yes," said Whimsy. "And if you examine the paper closely, you may find what he was writing about was not wholly ecclesiastical." Parker exhaled through his nose. "Peter, did you touch anything?" "Only my own conscience," said Whimsy, "and that not much." Parker rose. "All right, statements. Father Dimble, you first." Father Dimble, though still affronted, began to speak with the careful precision of a man who knows that every word may be repeated in court and in church. He described Mr. Bellingham's habitual Thursday visits, the accounts, the tea, the sound, the discovery. Parker listened, occasionally interjecting with an apparently trivial question: what time Mr. Bellingham had arrived, and how long Father Dimble had been in the office, whether anyone had called at the door. Whimsy watched the inspector's face and noted that Parker, too, had learned the value of the irrelevant. When Father Dimble finished, Parker turned to Mrs. Garrett. She answered with the smooth competence of a woman accustomed to explaining herself to committees. Times, quantities, procedures, everything had a place. She had fetched bread. She had returned. She had found chaos. She had sought to prevent panic. There had been no quarrel. Mr. Bellingham was respected. The books were in order. Whimsy, leaning against the table, said suddenly, "Did Mr. Bellingham ever threaten to go to the papers?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes hardened. "No." Miss Tibbet made a tiny sound, almost imperceptible. Whimsy's head turned fractionally, like a dog hearing a whistle. Parker said sharply, "Miss Tibbet." She swallowed. He said something about Father Dimble being sorry if the papers ever got hold of it." Father Dimble's face flamed. "Miss Tibbet," Parker's hand lifted. "Thank you, that's enough. We will decide later who ought to be sorry." The constable returned with Mr. Craven, who looked as if he had been plucked from a hymn and dropped into a police report. His eyes fixed on the body. His mouth worked soundlessly. Parker said, Name? Craven, whispered the man. Albert Craven. And what were you doing outside this door? Craven's gaze flicked helplessly to Mrs. Garrett. Waiting. For soup. I heard a noise. Then I heard voices. I didn't mean nothing. You meant something, said Parker. Craven licked his lips. Mr. Bellingham, he was always here Thursdays. He'd talk to Mrs. Garrett sometimes. About money, about papers. He said once, if a man knew what went on, he'd see some fine doings. Mrs. Garrett said icily, He's lying. Craven's eyes went wide. No, ma'am, I swear on my mother. Parker leaned closer. Fine doings where, Craven? Craven hesitated. His gaze slid toward the church walls, as though afraid the stones might repeat him. In the White House, he said at last. And outside it. Whimsy, very softly, as if quoting something classical, murmured, outside it. Parker straightened. Right, we're taking the accounts, the tea things, the sugar, the milk jug, and any cups used. Doctor, I want samples, and I want to know exactly who has been using this place after hours. Mrs. Garrett drew herself up. Inspector, this is a charity. Parker's voice was flat. Then it has nothing to fear from the truth. Whimsy added, almost kindly, except that truth is often the one thing charities cannot afford. Parker's men did their quiet work with an air of offended decency, as though the kitchen's ugliness were a personal insult. The constable produced brown paper, string, little glass tubes, and that faintly theatrical sealing wax, without which English law seems to feel improperly dressed. Cups were isolated like infected persons. The sugar tin was taken in hand, with the solemnity usually reserved for sacred vessels. Even the cracked jug, its pious bit of string still knotted about it, was lifted as though it might at any moment confess. Whimsy, leaning in the doorway, watched the ritual with an expression of mild amusement, but his eyes, now and then, flicked to faces rather than objects. Faces that he reflected were always the true exhibits. Mrs. Garrett stood with her hands folded on the back of a chair, as if anchoring herself against some inward drift. Her composure was admirable, and, like all admirable things, suspicious in the presence of death. Father Dimble hovered near the sink, alternately indignant and anxious, like a man torn between the desire to defend his parish and the fear that his parish might not deserve it. Miss Tibbet, very pale, kept close to the stove and looked as though she feared the kettle might accuse her if it boiled too loudly. Parker finished giving instructions and came to Whimsy. "You've got that look," he said under his breath. "What look?" asked Whimsy. "The one that says you've noticed something you're not going to tell me until I've made a fool of myself." Whimsy sighed. "My dear Charles, as you do yourself injustice, you seldom need my help for that." Parker's mouth tightened. "Out with it." Whimsy's gaze drifted to the corridor beyond, where the cream-painted walls seemed to listen with the discreet attention of servants. "Where did you put Mr. Craven?" "In the vestry still," Parker said. "Constable's with him." "Good," said Whimsy. "Then he will have time to grow either more frightened or more virtuous. Both states are useful, though not at the same moment." Parker's eyes narrowed. "Peter." "All right," said Whimsy, surrendering. "Two things. First, the arrangement." "The pencil," said Parker at once. "The pencil, the papers, the tray," said Whimsy. "Everything that looks as if a tidy-minded person came along after the event and attempted to make the scene less embarrassing. That suggests not panic, but a particular kind of panic. Social panic. The fear of appearing disorderly." "That's not a crime," Parker muttered. "No," said Whimsy, "but it narrows the field. The very poor don't care if a kitchen is messy. They've seen worse. The very rich don't care either. They have other people to be messy for them. But the respectable middle, They will conceal a corpse behind a doily. Parker glanced involuntarily at Mrs. Garrett. You think it's her? Whimsy shook his head. Not necessarily. She is too competent. Competent people, when they murder, do it with arrangements made beforehand, not with afterthoughts and pencils. Which leads to the second thing, the special disbursement. Parker's eyes sharpened. You saw that? One can read upside down, said Whimsy, a habit acquired at Eton. And I never thought it would be of use outside examinations and railway timetables. But there you are. Parker exhaled. We'll get the books. Yes, said Whimsy. And while you do, ask yourself, what sort of private disbursement would make a treasurer mention newspapers to a priest? Parker's face grew grim. Blackmail. Or scandal, said Whimsy. Or both, which is the usual arrangement. But it isn't the mere existence of a private payment that interests me. Charities, like families, have little hush-hush expenditures. A discreet doctor's fee, a railway ticket for a girl in trouble, a mattress for someone who cannot be seen sleeping in the street. The interesting question is, why was Mr. Bellingham sharp today? Why did he choose today to hint at exposure? Parker said, because he'd found something. Possibly, said Whimsy. Or because he believed he had found something and was wrong. Parker looked at him. Wrong how? Whimsy's eyes drifted to the kitchen window again. You notice, he said, how everyone tells the same story about that catch? We always leave it like that. It's a phrase as comforting as a prayer. Only phrases have habits too, and sometimes they are used because the truth is awkward. Parker's voice lowered. You think someone opened it after he died? After or before, said Whimsy, but I do think it was opened with intention. And here we come to those beastly little irrelevancies you so detest. How do you air a room without being seen to air it? You do it when the bell tolls, when the children sing, when the corridor's noisy. A small action disguised by a larger one. Parker muttered, you and your theatre. It's not theatre, said Whimsy. It's manners. The murderer here, if there is one, moves in manners. Across the room, Dr. Lancaster was speaking to the constable, giving instructions for samples. Miss Tibbet watched them with a fascinated horror. Whimsy drifted toward her, as though merely stretching his legs. Miss Tibbet, he said kindly, you are a conscientious person. Her chin lifted with automatic pride. I try to be. Good, said Whimsy. Then you will forgive a question that sounds impertinent. When you put the pencil straight, did you also put the paper straight? Her eyes widened. No, they were already like that. Clipped, neat. And the mug, said Whimsy. Did you place it where it is now? She shook her head quickly. No, it rolled. Whimsy nodded as though satisfied. Yes, that's what you said. Oh, it's only... He paused, letting the word hang like a dropped stitch. Mugs do not roll very far on linoleum unless the floor is sloped, or unless a foot helps them. She went white. I didn't. I know, said Whimsy gently. That's why I'm asking, because if you didn't, then somebody else did, and the person who nudges a mug into a more convincing place is the person who wants the scene to tell a particular story. Miss Tibbet's lips trembled. What story? Whimsy's tone became lightly ironic again, as though he were bored by melodrama. The story of a man who stood up, knocked a tray, and sat down to die like a gentleman without fussing the furniture. It is a charming story. Rather too charming. He turned away before her fear could become a confession. Parker, watching, said, Did you frighten her on purpose? I encouraged her memory, said Whimsy. Fear is excellent for memory. It is also excellent for lying. One must see which she chooses. Parker rubbed his forehead. All right. We'll check the floor, the cup's trajectory. Christ, Peter, listen to me. I sound like you. Whimsy's smile warmed. It's contagious, like influenza or morality. At that moment, from the corridor, came a sudden commotion. The quick, uneven thud of feet, the constable's barked command, and Mr. Craven's thin voice rising, half prayer, half panic. "No, no, I only meant," she said. "She said not to tell." Parker's head snapped around. "Who said?" Whimsy's eyes, very bright now, met Parker's. "There," he murmured. "That, my dear Charles, is what the White House knew." And before Parker could speak, Whimsy added, almost lazily, "Also, I do see whether Mrs. Garrett has been wearing a raincoat. There is a smear of wet grit by the mug that doesn't match Mr. Bellingham's shoes." Parker stared at him. "You've been looking at shoes," he said. "I told you," said Whimsy. "I'm being useful." Parker's constable reappeared in the kitchen doorway with the air of a man who has just discovered that the human soul is neither tidy nor cooperative. Behind him, Mr. Craven lurched, half-dragged, half-propelled, his raincoat flapping like a guilty flag. "I didn't mean—" he began again, and stopped because Mrs. Garrett had turned and was looking at him as one might look at a stain that has appeared on a clean cloth. Parker said sharply, "You said, she said not to tell. Who is she?" Craven's Adam's apple bobbed. His eyes darted everywhere except at Mrs. Garrett. I can't," he whispered. "So it's not for the likes of me." "The likes of you," said Whimsy gently, "are generally the only people who hear what the rest of us are too busy being respectable to notice. Come, Mr. Craven, nobody is asking you to write a leading article, merely to repeat what you have already said at the top of your lungs." Craven swallowed. It was Mrs. Munn. Father Dimble's face altered. "Mrs. Munn, but she's the Mothers' Union. She's a pillar," said Whimsy with mild sympathy. "Pillars, Padre, are admirable until you discover something unpleasant has been built behind them." Parker said, "What did Mrs. Munn tell you?" Craven licked his lips, not to come round the passage. "Not today. She said there'd been trouble, and if anyone asked, I was to say I hadn't seen nothing. And she said the place would be shut and there'd be no soup unless folks kept quiet." Mrs. Garrett's voice cut in like a knife. "That is a lie." Craven flinched. "No, ma'am, she said it. By the side door she did. When I come up." Parker's gaze went to Father Dimble. "Where is Mrs. Munn now?" "With the children," Father Dimble said, and there was a sudden sweat on his upper lip. "In the schoolyard." "Fetch her," said Parker. "Now." Father Dimble hesitated, the hesitation of a man who knows he's about to drag a decent woman through indecency. Then he went. Whimsy, meanwhile, had drifted, apparently at random, toward the kitchen table. Without touching the papers, he looked again at the list of disbursements and then at the newspaper folded beside it. He read the headline, and something like a private joke passed over his face. Parker noticed. "What?" "Nothing," said Whimsy. "Only, does it strike you as odd that a charity kitchen keeps a newspaper open at politics?" Mrs. Garrett said coldly, "People read. Even the poor." "Of course," said Whimsy, "and so do the anxious. Newspapers are splendid for wrapping up fish and for wrapping up scandals." Parker's patience frayed. "Peter, if you've got something, say it." Whimsy turned, and his voice became lightly conversational again, as though discussing the relative merits of port. "I was thinking," he said, "about that phrase, what the White House knew. Mrs. Garrett, you used 'must not get out,' as though it were a commandment. Father Dimble spoke of trust. Mr. Craven speaks of being warned off. Mrs. Munn, it appears, has been threatening the soup supply to keep tongue still." Mrs. Garrett's eyes flashed. "And you are making a melodrama out of women trying to keep order." "No," said Whimsy. "I'm making a timetable out of it." Parker's head lifted. "A timetable?" "Yes," said Whimsy, and now his tone held that faint, maddening amusement which always meant that his mind had begun to run ahead of other people's. "For example, Mr. Craven says Mrs. Munn warned him at the side door. That implies Mrs. Munn was here after Mr. Bellingham died, or believed he had died, or at least believed something was wrong. Yet Mrs. Munn was, until very recently, in charge of the children, which means she had to leave them, come here, speak to Craven, and then return to shepherd innocence in the rain. Parker stared. So, said Whimsy. Either she is a marvel of speed, or she was on the spot earlier than she admits. Mrs. Garrett's voice was too steady. Mrs. Munn has been running in and out all morning. She helps. That's what women do. Yes, said Whimsy, and what women do is often invisible until it becomes criminal. Miss Tibbet made a small, involuntary sound, half protest, half fear. Whimsy softened instantly. Not you, my dear. You merely put pencils straight. It is an amiable vice. Parker said to Craven, "Why were you listening outside the kitchen door?" Craven's face contorted in misery. "I heard voices, and I heard Mrs. Garrett's voice, sharp, and, I don't know, folks like me, when the quality are talking sharp, it means trouble comes downhill." Whimsy murmured, "A neat social observation, Mr. Craven, almost poetic." Parker snapped, "Were you in here before?" Craven shook his head violently. "No, I swear it, I only come for soup." Whimsy said mildly, "Do you ever come when there is no soup?" Craven blinked. "No, my lord. What would I come for?" "Quite," said Whimsy. "So if you were here early, it is because you were told, or because you expected something. Hunger is punctual, but curiosity is punctualer." Craven's eyes widened with the helpless outrage of a man being accused of having a mind. "I was cold, that's all." Parker said curtly, "Constable, keep him where he is. If he tries to leave, stop him." The constable nodded. Whimsy turned his attention back to the window. He took out his cigarette case, offered it to Parker, who refused on principle, and lit one himself with the air of a man preparing to watch a performance. "Tell me," he said casually to Mrs. Garrett, "do you keep any cleaning spirits here? Carbolic, ammonia, anything of that sort?" Mrs. Garrett's mouth tightened. "Of course, it's a kitchen." "And where?" asked Whimsy. "In the cupboard," she said, and pointed sharply. Parker moved at once, careful not to touch without gloves, and opened the cupboard. Bottles stood within in the severe ranks of domestic virtue. One label was new. Two new. Parker frowned. "This one's been recently replaced." Mrs. Garrett said, "We use it." "For what?" asked Whimsy. "For cleaning," she replied, as though he was slow. Whimsy exhaled smoke. "How very sensible. Only I wonder," he said softly, "whether someone cleaned this morning not because the kitchen was dirty, but because it had become morally inconvenient." At that moment, Father Dimble returned, breathless, with Mrs. Munn. Mrs. Munn was a plump, energetic woman with a face designed by Providence to look trustworthy. Soft cheeks, mild eyes, yes, and the kind of smile that promised cake at church bazaars. Her wet umbrella dripped indignantly on the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded at once. "Father Dimble dragged me away from the children as if I were a criminal. If anyone is to be dragged, it ought to be—" She stopped dead because she had seen the body. For 1 second, her smile remained. Frozen, absurd, grotesque. Then it vanished, and the mild eyes filled with a quick, hot brightness that was not grief. Parker said, "Mrs. Munn, did you speak to Mr. Craven at the side door this morning?" Mrs. Munn's gaze snapped to Craven. It was not the look of a woman who recognizes a parishioner. It was the look of a woman who recognizes a witness. "I may have," she said. "One speaks to all sorts." "It's a charity." "Did you tell him not to come round the passage?" Parker pressed. Mrs. Munn's hands tightened on the umbrella handle until the knuckles showed white. "I told him," she said, "to keep out of the way. There were arrangements." Whimsy murmured, very softly, "Arrangements again." Parker said, What arrangements? Mrs. Munn's mouth opened, and for the first time in the morning she looked not respectable, but trapped. I was told, she said at last, that there had been an accident, and that if people started gossiping, the work would suffer. Told by whom? Parker demanded. Mrs. Munn's eyes flicked, just for a fraction of a second, toward Mrs. Garrett. The movement was tiny, instinctive, and entirely damning. Whimsy watched it with the detached satisfaction of a mathematician watching the last number fall into place, while still refusing, irritatingly, to show anyone else the sum. Parker saw it too. His voice went very quiet. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, "I think you had better sit down." Mrs. Garrett did not sit down. She remained standing, hands still upon the chair back, as though the chair were a rail on a ship and the kitchen had, without warning, begun to pitch. Only her eyes altered, becoming very bright, very still, like a woman watching a door she knows will not hold. "I'm perfectly capable of standing," she said. "That," Parker replied, "is not in dispute." He turned to the constable. "Take Mrs. Munn's statement in full. Here. Now. And keep Mr. Craven where you can see him." Mrs. Munn made a small, strangled sound of injured virtue. "Inspector, this is outrageous. I've been nothing but—" "Helpful?" said Whimsy very softly. "Yes. Help is often the first thing that kills, when it is offered too quickly." Mrs. Munn swung on him. "And who are you to speak?" "Only a man," said Whimsy, "who has watched helpfulness carry bodies down staircases and hang hats over bloodstains. It is always done with the best intentions." Mrs. Garrett's voice cut in, controlled and clipped. "Mrs. Munn knew nothing until I told her. If she spoke unwisely, it was because she panicked, for the work, for the children, for the parish." Parker said, "You told her there had been an accident." "Yes," said Mrs. Garrett. "At what time?" Parker pressed. Mrs. Garrett's glance flicked instinctively to the wall above the stove, where a cheap clock hung with an air of apologizing for its own existence. The clock showed 12:35. Its second hand moved with a faint, busy tick that sounded suddenly obscene. "About 12, she said. Whimsy said as if idly, "That clock is fast." Miss Tibbet started. "No, it isn't." Whimsy looked at her. "Isn't it?" She hesitated. "It keeps time. I mean, Mrs. Garrett says it does." Mrs. Garrett's chin lifted. "It does." Parker's eyes narrowed at the clock as if it were a suspect. "What's the correct time, then?" "The church clock," said Father Dimble automatically. "It's reliable." "And what did it strike?" asked Whimsy. "When Mr. Bellingham died?" Father Dimble blinked, thrown. 12. Midday. Whimsy nodded. "Thank you. So if this clock reads 12:35 now, and the bell struck 12, then either time is behaving very oddly in St. Olave's, or your kitchen clock is 15 minutes ahead of the universe." Mrs. Garrett said coldly, "We set it ahead so we don't run late." "How very prudent," said Whimsy. "It also makes everyone's statements ahead of themselves, which is less prudent." Parker's mouth tightened with the pleasure of a policeman offered something concrete. "Right. Everybody's 12 becomes meaningless until we fix it against the church bell. Father Dimble, when did Mr. Bellingham arrive?" "About 11:15, said Father Dimble. "By which clock?" Parker snapped. Father Dimble looked helpless. "Mine, in the office." Whimsy murmured, "And is that set ahead too for moral improvement?" Father Dimble reddened. "It keeps proper time." Parker said, "We'll check it." Mrs. Garrett made an abrupt gesture, as if to cut through the pedantry. "Inspector, you can play with clocks all day. It won't alter the fact that Mr. Bellingham is dead." "No," said Parker. "But it may alter who was in the room when he stopped being alive." Whimsy, still watching Mrs. Garrett, said lightly, The interesting thing about a clock set ahead is that it gives one the sensation of having less time than one truly has. Some people find that stimulating. Mrs. Garrett stared at him. "What are you implying now?" "Nothing at all," said Whimsy. "Merely observing your household method. You rush, you manage, you anticipate, you arrange." Mrs. Munn burst out, "We have to. Men like Mr. Bellingham come in with their ledgers and their faces like thunder, and they don't care if there are children crying and kettles boiling. They just—" She stopped, suddenly aware that she had said too much. Whimsy's voice was mild. "And Mr. Bellingham came in today with a thunder face." Mrs. Munn's cheeks mottled. "He was angry." "With whom?" Parker demanded. Mrs. Munn's mouth tightened, her eyes slid again toward Mrs. Garrett, and Mrs. Garrett's composure made a tiny, involuntary movement, as though she had felt a pinprick through cloth. Whimsy said gently, "Mrs. Munn, you are devoted to this place. Devotion is admirable, but devotion can become a sort of intoxication. One begins to believe the work is holy enough to excuse any method of preserving it." Mrs. Munn's breath came fast. "You don't understand what it takes, what people say, what they do if they could shut us down." "And what," said Parker, "would shut you down?" Silence. It was the sort of silence that spreads quickly when everyone knows the answer but nobody wants to pronounce it aloud. Whimsy, and very softly, supplied a possibility, like a man suggesting a word in a crossword. "A name," he said. "A story, a connection." Mrs. Garrett said sharply, "This is absurd." Parker's gaze was fixed on her now. "You said it must not get out. You said it like someone who has experience of things getting out. What precisely was Mr. Bellingham threatening?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes flashed. "Nothing." Miss Tibbet, in a sudden burst of miserable courage, said, "He said Father Dimble would be sorry if the papers got hold of it." Father Dimble said, "For heaven's sake." Whimsy held up a hand. "Padre, do not rebuke honesty. It is too rare." Parker said, "Dimble, what would the papers get hold of?" Father Dimble's face had gone a shade grayer. "I don't know." "Do you," said Parker, "have any private correspondence with Mr. Bellingham? Any quarrel? Any arrangement?" Father Dimble's voice came out stiff. "No." Whimsy observed, almost lazily. "Priests often say no when the truth is yes, but not as you mean." Father Dimble turned on him. "My lord." Whimsy looked back with a curious gentleness. "Forgive me, it is not an accusation. It is merely that people hide things for reasons that feel righteous at the time." Parker gestured to the constable. "Take Father Dimble's statement again. Slowly. Note every time reference. Note every movement. Note who spoke to whom." The constable began, pencil poised. Whimsy, drifting again toward the door, said as though to himself, "There is another question, you know." Parker, without looking up, said, "What now?" Whimsy flicked ash into the hearth with an air of aesthetic distaste. "Why would a treasurer, who is, by all accounts, punctual, methodical, and unromantic, choose to confront someone in a kitchen with tea and children rather than in the office with a door and dignity?" Parker looked up sharply. "You think he didn't mean to meet here?" "I think," said Whimsy, "he may have been brought here, or lured, or interrupted, and the person who needed him in the kitchen needed one thing, to keep the office untroubled." Mrs. Garrett's voice was very calm. "That is nonsense." Whimsy's eyes moved, almost idly, to the office door down the corridor, the one Father Dimble had mentioned earlier. Then back to the kitchen again, the smell of disinfectant, the new bottle, the 2 clean ranks of domestic order. "Is it?" Whimsy murmured. "Because if there is one place in a building where one can wash, wipe, boil, and dispose without comment, it is a kitchen." Parker's expression hardened. "Search the office," he ordered. Father Dimble protested. "Inspector, Those are parish records. Then they'll stand a look, said Parker. 2 constables moved down the corridor. Mrs. Garrett's hand, still on the chair back, tightened. Whimsy watched that tightening and said lightly, to nobody in particular, "Now we shall discover whether the White House has been keeping time or keeping secrets." Outside, the children's voices had faded. The rain tapped steadily at the frosted glass. And in the kitchen, the second hand of the too-fast clock went on busily, as if it were hurrying everyone towards something that could no longer be postponed. The constables returned from the office with the careful, dissatisfied faces of men who have not found a pistol behind the blotting pad, and but have found something worse: paper. One carried a shallow deed box, another held a sheaf of envelopes secured with an elastic band. The third, awkwardly, as though it offended him to touch it at all, bore a leather dispatch case of the sort that suggests city clerks and discreet assignations. It was not locked. It was, in fact, ostentatiously unlocked, like a door left open to prove one has nothing to hide. Parker took the dispatch case, opened it without flourish, and looked inside. For a moment he said nothing. His face did not change, but a kind of cold attention settled on it like frost. Whimsy, watching him, remarked lightly, "Ah, the papers. One always ends in England with papers." Parker took out the top item, a memorandum on headed paper. Not parish paper. Even at a distance, Whimsy could see the quality of it. Thick, expensive, faintly creamy, designed to look innocent while being permanent. Parker's thumb held down the corner, and Whimsy's monocle flashed as he leaned, not too near, and let his eyes do the indiscreet work. Parker said very quietly, "This isn't St. Olave's." "No," said Whimsy. "It looks more like Whitehall's poor relation." Mrs. Garrett's voice came, clipped and unnatural. "Those are not ours." Parker's head lifted. They were in Father Dimble's office, in a dispatch case on the floor behind his desk. Father Dimble made a sound that was half outrage, half prayer. "Inspector, those are private, parish matters." Parker's eyes stayed on the sheet. Parish matters don't come typed in triplicate with a carbon. Mrs. Munn, who had been sitting very stiffly with her umbrella across her knees like a weapon, whispered, "Oh." It was not the O of surprise. It was the O of recognition, of a thing long feared finally taking shape. Whimsy said conversationally, "Padre, I don't ask what sins you have committed. I merely inquire. Who taught you to file them?" Father Dimble's face flamed. "My lord, this is intolerable." "And yet," said Whimsy, "we tolerate a great deal. That is our national genius." Parker, still holding the memorandum, said, "There's a name on this. Not yours, Dimble." Father Dimble's mouth opened. No words came out. Parker read it aloud, slowly, for the benefit of everyone and the kitchen clock's hurried tick. Sir Reginald Marchbanks. Miss Tibbet's hand flew to her mouth. Mrs. Garrett went perfectly still. Whimsy's eyebrows rose the fraction they always did when the world offered him an absurdity wrapped in horror. "Ah, Marchbanks," he murmured. "Why, Charles, that sounds like the sort of man who has never knowingly been in a soup kitchen unless it were opening it with a ribbon." Parker ignored him. "Dimble, who is Sir Reginald Marchbanks?" Father Dimble's voice came out in a hoarse rush. "A patron." "A patron," repeated Whimsy softly. "Ah, patronage, the polite name for dependence." Parker's gaze sharpened. "What sort of patron?" "The sort," Father Dimble said, forcing steadiness, "who gives money." "And wants something," said Whimsy almost kindly. Father Dimble jerked his head up. "No." Parker's voice was flat. "There's a draft letter here, in your hand. It says," he glanced down, "in view of recent anxieties and in the interest of avoiding public misunderstandings, and it asks for continued discretion." "What public misunderstandings? Hi, Dimble." Father Dimble's knuckles whitened on the edge of the sink. "Inspector, this is charity work. There are always misunderstandings." Whimsy let smoke drift from his lips, watching how it curled toward the half-open window as though drawn. "Yes," he said, "and misunderstandings are particularly plentiful when gentlemen of title attach themselves to respectable causes. One never knows whether they are buying virtue or borrowing it." Mrs. Garrett spoke, and her tone was a little too calm, like a voice trained to keep panic from showing in the face. "This has nothing to do with Mr. Bellingham's death." Parker swung on her. "It has everything to do with why you wanted no fuss." Mrs. Garrett said, I wanted no fuss because we have children and mothers and human beings who depend on this place." "And Sir Reginald Marchbanks depends on it too?" Parker asked. A silence fell, heavy, congealed, not like the earlier silences of shock, but the silence of knowledge that has been locked away for years and is now rattling its chains. Whimsy said lightly, into that silence, "One might say, Mrs. Garrett, that you have been running a soup kitchen and a screen." Mrs. Munn burst out suddenly, her soft face working with indignation. "It was for the work. We couldn't have kept the doors open without him, without the money. And when people began to whisper, when that horrid woman at St. Barnabas's made remarks about men visiting, we had to be careful." "Men visiting," said Whimsy, and his voice remained delicately detached, but his eyes had sharpened. Plural?" Mrs. Munn froze. Mrs. Garrett said sharply, "Don't be melodramatic, Edith." Parker said, "Answer the question." Mrs. Munn's breath came fast. "Sometimes Sir Reginald came. Sometimes his secretary. Sometimes—" She swallowed. "Sometimes Mr. Bellingham?" Whimsy nodded. "The treasurer, making sure the patronage didn't become embezzlement, a dreary but necessary part." Mrs. Garrett's voice cracked just once. "He was always sniffing, always prying, as if he wanted the place to fail so he could be proved right about people." Parker said sharply, "About what people?" Mrs. Garrett did not answer. Her eyes had gone to the dispatch case again, hungry, defensive, terrified. Whimsy, who had been watching her hands, remarked almost idly, "If I may offer a small and perhaps revolting observation. Mrs. Garrett, your hands are clean." Sir Garrett stared at him. "What?" "Yes," said Whimsy, "scrupulously clean. For a woman who has been hauling bread baskets in the rain and running a kitchen. You have the look of someone who washed not because she was dirty, but because she had touched something she could not bear to feel upon her skin." Mrs. Garrett's face altered. For the first time all day her composure faltered into something recognizably human, a flare of fury, and beneath it a raw fear. "That's nonsense," she said, but her voice had lost conviction. Parker stepped closer. "Where did you wash your hands, Mrs. Garrett?" "In the scullery." "Like anyone," she snapped. Whimsy's tone remained maddeningly polite. "With the new bottle." Mrs. Garrett's eyes flicked, again that tiny betraying movement, toward the cupboard. Parker turned his head slowly to it. "What new bottle?" "Mrs." Garrett said too quickly. "There isn't—" Parker strode to the cupboard, opened it, and took out the newest labeled bottle with gloved hands. He held it up. The label read, "Disinfectant," in blunt black letters. The kind of thing nobody reads twice. Parker said, "Smell it, Doctor." Dr. Langster took it, sniffed, and his brows drew together. "This is strong and odd. It's not the usual." Whimsy murmured, "Odd. Like politics in a soup kitchen." Parker's gaze snapped back to Mrs. Garrett. "Where did this come from?" Mrs. Garrett said nothing. Mrs. Munn, in a small, strangled voice, said, "We had to. He said, Sir Reginald said, if there was any bother, any talk, then it must be cleaned. Everything must be cleaned." Whimsy's eyes closed briefly, as though in distaste. "So the White House was instructed," he said softly, "to keep itself pure." Parker's voice was very quiet. And when Bellingham threatened exposure, somebody decided purity required more than disinfectant. Mrs. Garrett's mouth trembled, only for an instant. Then she lifted her chin. "You don't know what you're saying," she said. Whimsy looked at her with that curious gentleness again. "Oh, I think I do," he said, "but I haven't the least idea yet why you said it to yourself." Outside, somewhere in the church, the bell began again, one stroke, then another, marking the hour with heavy impartiality. The too-fast kitchen clock tried to race it, ticking with frantic industry. And Whimsy, hearing both, smiled faintly, as though time itself had just supplied him with a clue in the form of a disagreement. Parker had taken the bottle from Dr. Lancaster and was turning it slowly in his gloved hands, and as though the label might blush and tell the truth if stared at long enough. The word disinfectant sat there with bland confidence, an honest noun doing dishonest work. "New," Parker said. "Too new and too strong." Mrs. Garrett's eyes followed it with an unwilling fixation. It was not the look of a woman merely annoyed by police interference. It was the look of a woman watching a trap close and calculating, at speed, what fingers might yet be pulled free. Whimsy, who had moved to the window again, spoke without turning. "Charles," he said, "will you do something that will make you feel foolish?" Parker's jaw tightened. "If I must." "Open the window," said Whimsy, "and then shut it properly." Parker looked at him as though he had suggested dancing a jig over the corpse, but he went. He lifted the sash the extra inch, then let it down. The catch resisted slightly, then clicked into place with a faint finality. "There," Parker said. "Happy?" Whimsy's gaze remained on the latch. "Moderately. Now open it again, only this time, listen." Parker frowned and obeyed. As the catch released, there came a tiny, almost inaudible rasp. Metal on metal, as though something had been scratched and smoothed and scratched again. Parker's eyes narrowed. "What the devil?" "The catch has been filed," said Whimsy softly. "Or sanded. Just enough to make it seem to sit when it doesn't. A quick hand could lower the window and leave it looking shut to an unobservant eye, while still leaving a draft. Enough to air a smell, enough to make everyone think it was shut." Parker held the latch closer, examining the worn edge. "Who'd do that?" "A person," said Whimsy, "who needed to open a window often, quietly, without advertising it as an action." Mrs. Garrett's voice came out sharp. "This is nonsense. Old fittings wear." "Not like that," said Parker, and there was a new note in him, a policeman's satisfaction at finding a physical lie. Dr. Lancaster cleared his throat. "Inspector, if I may, what smell are we discussing?" "A body smells, yes, but not at once. Not within minutes." Whimsy turned at last. "Precisely," he said, and smiled faintly, as though congratulating the doctor on passing an examination he had not known he was taking. "So if someone is eager to air the kitchen, it suggests not ordinary death, but something else. Something immediate." "Chemicals," Parker said slowly. Whimsy nodded. "Or something used in cooking that becomes, with one alteration, quite unfit for children and very fit for murder." Mrs. Munn gave a little choking sound. "You can't mean—" Whimsy's voice remained mild. "My dear Mrs. Munn, I am not meaning anything. I'm merely pointing out that kitchens have two virtues. They are full of substances, and they are full of reasons to explain those substances away." Parker set the bottle down with a care that was almost tender. "Right," he said. "We'll send that for analysis." "And the tea," said Whimsy, "and the sugar, and the condensed milk, and, if you please, the kettle." Parker stared. "The kettle?" Whimsy's eyes flicked to Miss Tibbet. "Has the kettle been boiled since Mr. Bellingham's incident?" Miss Tibbet went crimson. Yes, you told me to." "I did," said Whimsy, "and I apologize. I'm sometimes too fond of symbolism. Never mind. And the kettle is less important than the cups. He crossed to the spilled tea line and crouched, not touching, merely looking. His monocle caught the light. His tone became idle again, the tone of a man discussing wallpaper. "Miss Tibbet," he said, "when you poured, did you pour from the teapot into the mug?" "Yes." "Did Mr. Bellingham put anything in it himself?" Wimsey asked. "Sugar." "No, he took it plain. He said sugar gave him indigestion." Wimsey's gaze lifted to Mrs. Garrett. "A man who avoids sugar," he observed, "is a man who is difficult to poison in the usual charitable way." Mrs. Garrett's lips tightened. "Is that supposed to be a joke?" "It is supposed to be a warning," said Wimsey, still softly. Parker said abruptly, "Dimble, you said he came in at 11:15. What did he do first?" Father Dimble's voice was strained. "Now, he went into my office. He sat down. He said he wished to speak privately. He was displeased." "About what?" Parker pressed. Father Dimble swallowed. "About money." "Sir Reginald's money," said Parker. Father Dimble flinched. "About the way it was given, about letters, about discretion." Wimsey murmured, "Discretion. The English substitute for innocence." Parker went on. "Then why did Bellingham end up in the kitchen?" Father Dimble's eyes darted once toward Mrs. Garrett, then away again, as though he were ashamed of his own reflexes. "He asked for tea," Father Dimble said. "He said he was cold, and Mrs. Garrett always insists that visitors, anyone, have tea. It is her way." Mrs. Garrett's voice came out in a brittle snap. "We offer hospitality. That is not a crime." "No," said Parker. "Oh, but it's an opportunity." Wimsey rose smoothly. "May I ask," he said, "who fetched the tea things? The tray, the mug?" "Miss Tibbet," said Mrs. Garrett at once. "Always Miss Tibbet." Wimsey's gaze rested on Miss Tibbet with a curious gentleness. "Always," he repeated. "How comforting," Miss Tibbet whispered. "I only did what I always do." "And that," said Wimsey, "is precisely why it matters." He drifted toward the dispatch case again, and Parker, watching him, did not stop him, because he had learned by bitter experience that Wimsey's hands stayed cleaner than his mind. Wimsey looked at the cream paper, the typed memoranda, the drafts about public misunderstandings. Then he said, very lightly, "Sir Reginald Marchbanks, does he ever come through the church, I wonder, or always by the side door?" Mrs. Munn's face worked. Her soft eyes became suddenly hard. "He comes by the side door," she said, "so as not to be seen. He is kind, but he must be protected from gossip." Wimsey nodded. "Protected from gossip," he echoed. "So the White House protects him, the parish protects the White House, and Mr. Bellingham, being a man of figures, threatened to protect the public from everyone." Mrs. Garrett's voice was low. "He threatened to ruin us." "To save you," said Wimsey, "from the sort of patronage that rots a place from inside." He may even have imagined he was being chivalrous. Parker's eyes narrowed. "You think this is about Marchbanks?" "I think," said Wimsey carefully, "that Marchbanks is about something else, a second life perhaps, a second set of morals, and someone here has been paid, quietly, to keep it quiet." Mrs. Garrett's composure finally slipped into anger pure enough to be almost a relief. "You don't understand," she said. "You sit there with your cleverness and your Latin and your jokes. You don't know what it is to keep a place like this alive. To watch women come in with children who haven't eaten. To watch men come in who smell of gin and sleep. To scrape and count and beg, and then have someone like Bellingham threaten to take the whole thing away because he found a word in a letter that offended his decency." Wimsey listened with an odd seriousness. When she finished, he said very gently, "Oh, I understand the begging. I only don't accept the bargain." Parker said, "Mrs. Garrett, Did you meet Bellingham in the office? Yes, she said sharply. Briefly. At what time? Parker asked. Mrs. Garrett's gaze flicked again, damnably, toward the too-fast clock. Whimsy said, almost lazily, Don't look at that. Look at the bell. Mrs. Garrett's throat worked. Just after the bell struck 11. Parker's eyes sharpened. So Bellingham arrives at 11:15, talks to Dimble, then meets you just after 11, which is before he arrives. Mrs. Garrett's face went blank. Miss Tibbet gave a little cry. Parker's voice went very quiet. Mrs. Garrett, you've just put yourself into the building before your own story allows. Mrs. Garrett opened her mouth, closed it, and then said with sudden, desperate stiffness, The clock is set ahead. Whimsy's tone was like silk over steel. Yes, he said, and your memory appears to be set ahead too. Parker stood still for a long moment. He's watching her as one watches an animal deciding whether it will bolt or bite. Then he said, evenly, We're going to test the chronology, all of it. Who came by which door, at what bell, and why? And if your charity depends on lies, Mrs. Garrett, then it has been living on poisoned tea for a very long time. Whimsy added, almost absently, as if completing a thought, and someone, somewhere, has been very careful indeed that the window always looks shut. Parker's remark about testing the chronology had the immediate effect of producing in the occupants of the kitchen that special rigidity which appears when polite people are asked to behave like evidence. They were moved, without being told they were moved, into positions that could be described later. Miss Tibbet was set by a constable's unobtrusive gesture, and upon the edge of a chair with her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting an examination. Mrs. Munn, still clutching her umbrella as though it were a scepter of injured innocence, was stationed near the doorway, close enough to flee, too close to do so without notice. Father Dimble remained by the sink, as if proximity to running water offered moral absolution. Mrs. Garrett stood where she had stood all morning, behind the chair, and her hands upon its back now had the look of hands holding down a lid. Parker sent one constable to the church. I want the verger, he said, and I want the bell times. When it struck, who rang it, if anybody touched it, if anybody went in or out while it rang. Ask the organist, too, if there is one. Churches teem with people who hear everything and say nothing. The constable departed with alacrity. Whimsy, who had drifted again toward the half-open dispatch case, said as though continuing a private train of thought, Do remember to ask whether the bell is on the quarter chimes as well. People forget those and then swear, blind they heard 12 when it was only a flourish at 11:45. Parker shot him a look. You know this isn't a game. No, said Whimsy. It's merely played like one. He turned to Miss Tibbet with a mildness that made her flinch more than harshness would have done. Miss Tibbet, he said, when you say Mr. Bellingham arrived at 11:15, do you remember why you looked at the time? I was watching for him, she said miserably. He always came. He liked everything to be ready. Ready, murmured Whimsy. Yes, that's the word of the day. And when did you begin to make the tea? Parker asked. After he came, said Miss Tibbet. Mrs. Garrett, she said we'd better. She said he looked cold. Mrs. Garrett's voice snapped out. He did, Parker said. Mrs. Garrett, you said a moment ago you spoke to him just after 11. Mrs. Garrett's face had the look of a person holding very still under a blow. I said, about that time. About that time by which clock? Parker insisted. Mrs. Garrett's eyes flicked in spite of herself to the fast kitchen clock. Whimsy said softly, Don't do that. It makes you look as though you've been trained. Mrs. Garrett's cheeks went blotched. We set it ahead. Everyone knows it. Who set it? Whimsy asked. Mrs. Garrett stared. What? The clock, said Whimsy. Who, precisely, sets it ahead? Is it always 15 minutes? Is it ever 10? Does it change when the vicar is late, or when the treasurer is early?" Mrs. Garrett's mouth tightened. "I set it, because people drift." "Quite," said Whimsy. "And did you set it today?" A pause. Not long, but long enough for the kettle to cough and for the linoleum to seem to hold its breath. "Yes," Mrs. Garrett said at last. "This morning." "At what time?" Parker asked. Mrs. Garrett's voice grew sharper, as though sharpness might cut through the noose. "Before we opened, before anyone came." "And what time did you open?" Parker pursued. Mrs. Garrett's eyes flashed. 10:30, like always." Whimsy said, 10:30 by the church bell?" Mrs. Garrett's lips parted, closed again. "By my watch." Parker's gaze dropped to her wrist. "May I see it?" She hesitated a fraction, then thrust out her arm as though the gesture were insulting. Parker looked, noted, and said to the constable, "Write it down. Time now by her watch." Whimsy, watching, observed mildly, "Watches are such intimate little liars. They tell you what you wish to believe about your own punctuality." Parker said, "Father Dimble, when Bellingham arrived, where were you?" "In my office," said Father Dimble stiffly. "Alone?" "Yes." "And the side door?" Parker asked. "Was it locked?" Father Dimble hesitated. "We don't always lock it during opening hours. People come for help." "People," said Whimsy. "Or patrons." Mrs. Munn's umbrella handle creaked as her grip tightened. Parker rounded on her. "Mrs. Munn, you said Sir Reginald comes by the side door. When did you last see him?" "I haven't," she said too quickly. "Not recently." Whimsy's voice was airy. "My dear lady, do recently is a word people use when they can't remember whether it was yesterday or 5 years. Try again. Was it this week?" Mrs. Munn's eyes darted to Father Dimble, then to Mrs. Garrett, and the movement was like watching a ping-pong ball in a moral vacuum. He doesn't come often," she said. Parker said, "Answer the question." Mrs. Munn swallowed. "Last Thursday." "And Bellingham always came on Thursdays," said Whimsy, still mild. "How convenient. Patron and treasurer in alternating appointments, like a doctor and a dentist." Mrs. Garrett burst out, "That is not fair." "No," said Whimsy. "It is simply symmetrical. Symmetry, I find, is often a sign that someone has arranged the schedule." Parker said sharply, "Did Sir Reginald come today?" "No," said Mrs. Munn at once. Mrs. Garrett said at the same moment, "Of course not." Whimsy's eyebrows rose. "How delightful," he said. "You agree perfectly. That always comforts me, because people who have not rehearsed rarely agree perfectly." Mrs. Garrett's voice cracked into fury. "You are twisting everything." Parker's tone was flat. "Twisting is what murderers do. We're only pulling straight." There was a sudden knock at the door into the corridor, 3 quick taps as though the church itself were impatient. The constable returned with the verger, Mr. Pottle, who wore the stricken importance of a man whose parish has been touched by police. "Inspector," he began, "I've been asked. This is a terrible business." Parker cut in. "Mr. Pottle, the bells. Who rang them at 12? "I did," said the verger. "Same as always." "Were you in the bell tower all morning?" Parker asked. "Not all morning," said Pottle, affronted. "I've duties. I was in and out, but the Angelus at 12, yes." Whimsy said, "Did anyone speak to you about ringing early, or late, or not making a fuss?" The verger stared. "No, my lord." Parker said, "Did anyone come through the church, Sir Reginald Marchbanks, for instance?" Pottle's face did a curious thing. It tried to look blank and ended by looking guilty. "I couldn't say," he said. "Gentlemen come and go." Whimsy's voice turned almost lazy. "Pottle, my dear fellow, I have seen you look at hymn books as if they were thieves. You do not fail to notice a baronet." Pottle's ears reddened. He has been here," he admitted. Not today, but often enough. Comes in quiet, stands at the back, goes out by the side. And at what times? Parker demanded. Pottle spread his hands. Miserable. It varies. But late mornings, when it's empty. Late mornings, murmured Whimsy. When the kitchen is busy and the church is empty. Excellent camouflage. Mrs. Garrett said in a low, desperate voice, "This is irrelevant." Whimsy looked at her very gently. Nothing is irrelevant when a man dies of tea, and you are more frightened of being seen than of being caught. Parker said to the verger, "When you were ringing at 12, could you see the side passage?" "No," said Pottle, "but I can hear the side door. It has a squeak." Whimsy's head lifted. "A squeak?" "Yes," said the verger, eager now, glad to offer a fact that was not moral. "Been needing oil for months. You can hear it clear as anything in the transept when the place is quiet." Parker said, "Did you hear it today?" Pottle hesitated. Yes. I did, now you mention. Just before I went up to ring. Someone came in." Parker said, "How long before noon?" Pottle frowned, counting inwardly as a man counts coins. "A few minutes. 5, perhaps." Whimsy's gaze flicked to Mrs. Garrett's hands on the chair back. Her knuckles were white. Parker said, "Who came in by the side door at 5 to 12? Mrs. Garrett's voice came out thin. "People come in for help." Parker said, "Name one." Silence. Then Mrs. Munn, very faintly as though the words were choking her, said, "It might have been Sir Reginald's man." Whimsy murmured, "The secretary, or the emissary, or the conscience with gloves." Parker's eyes narrowed to slits. "You said he wasn't here today." Mrs. Munn's face collapsed into wretchedness. "I said Sir Reginald wasn't. I didn't say—" "You didn't say because you didn't want to," Parker snapped. "Right. Now we're getting somewhere." Whimsy, almost absent-mindedly, said, "Charles, if someone came in by the side door at 5 to 12 and Bellingham died at noon, or shortly after, then the person who arrived had just enough time to speak to him, to add something to his cup, to wipe something away, to open a window, to make a telephone call to Mrs. Munn, and to vanish again before the bell had finished being virtuous." Parker stared at him. "That's a plausible timetable," said Whimsy. "And timetables, like murders, are made of minutes." Parker turned slowly back to Mrs. Garrett. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, "who has access to this building by the side door besides you, the priest, and the verger?" Mrs. Garrett's mouth trembled. She bit it hard. Then, very quietly, she said the one thing she had not yet said all morning. "Sir Reginald has a key." And in the hush that followed, the kitchen clock went on ticking 15 minutes ahead, as though it were trying, futilely, to get away from the truth before it arrived. Mrs. Garrett's admission fell into the kitchen like a plate dropped on stone. No melodrama, no shattering clang, only that dull final sound which tells one a thing cannot be mended into its former shape. "A key," repeated Parker very quietly. "Yes," said Mrs. Garrett, and her voice now had the curious flatness of a person who has stopped trying to be believed and has begun, instead, to tell the truth as one might recite a debt. He had one made, years ago. Not for convenience, because he didn't like being seen fumbling with the bell pull and waiting for someone to open like a tradesman. The verger, who had been swelling with the importance of providing facts, looked suddenly as if he would like to dissolve into the tiles. "I didn't know," he muttered. I wouldn't." "No," said Whimsy gently. "Of course not. You would never knowingly assist in a scandal. You only assist in it by standing very still and calling it respect." Parker ignored him. "Who else has a key?" Mrs. Garrett hesitated, and in that hesitation one could see the last little flicker of management, the instinct to withhold a name as though withholding might still preserve something. Then her shoulders dropped the fraction of an inch, which is the body's way of giving in. "Mr. Harcourt," she said, "is Sir Reginald's secretary." Mrs. Munn made a noise like a suppressed sob. He's not a bad man," Whimsy observed with faint weariness. "Secretaries are rarely bad men. They are rather men employed to make bad things look administrative." Parker's pencil scratched. "Full name?" "Gerald Harcourt," said Mrs. Garrett. "At least, that's what he calls himself." "At least," said Whimsy softly, and the little phrase, innocently spoken, made Father Dimble start as though struck. Parker looked up. "What do you mean by that, Peter?" "I mean," said Whimsy, "that secretaries attached to discreet patrons often have two habits. They keep keys, and they keep names." Parker said sharply, "Do you have an address for him?" Mrs. Garrett shook her head. "He writes, he telephones. He doesn't come like ordinary people. He comes when it suits." "And today," said Parker, "it suited him at 5 to 12. Mrs. Garrett's mouth twitched, not with humor but with the reflex of a woman trying to maintain some last scrap of control. "You don't know it was him." Parker's tone was unyielding. "We know someone used the side door then. The verger heard it. You admit a third party had a key, and Bellingham was dead at noon. It's enough to begin." Whimsy drifted back to the window catch, examining it with that patient, almost scholarly interest he reserved for things that lied while looking respectable. "It's also enough," he said, "to explain the filed catch. A man who comes and goes by the side door and wishes to open windows without attracting comment would take pains to make both actions silent and deniable." Mrs. Garrett's voice sharpened again, once with sudden bitterness. "You think he filed it? He wouldn't dirty his hands. He'd have someone else do it." "Ah," said Whimsy. "And whom would he have?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes went unwillingly to the verger. Mr. Pottle went scarlet. "Now look here." "No," said Whimsy quietly, and the soft tone stopped the verger more effectively than a shout. "Not you. Too obvious, and too frightened. Sir Reginald's people don't employ frightened men. They employ devoted ones." Mrs. Munn whispered, "We only wanted to keep the work going." Parker said, "Then you chose a curious method." Mrs. Munn's cheeks grew wet, and her voice, when it came, was both furious and pleading. "You don't understand what it was like," she said. "The gossip, the hints. They're the women who wouldn't bring their children if they thought gentlemen were coming here for reasons. And Sir Reginald said he loved the work. He said he wanted to help, but he couldn't help if he was made a spectacle." Whimsy remarked, "No gentleman can endure being a spectacle, unless he's making one." Mrs. Garrett's head jerked up. "Stop it." Whimsy looked at her. "Stop what?" "Turning it into filth," she said, and for the first time her anger sounded like pain. "It was not that. Not in the way you're thinking." Parker's eyes narrowed. "Then what way?" Mrs. Garrett's lips parted, closed, parted again. She looked for the old committee language. Misunderstandings, arrangements, discretion, and found it suddenly useless, like a key that no longer fits. It was control, she said at last, and when her voice was very low. He liked order. He liked to see things run properly. He liked being obeyed. Whimsy's expression altered, almost imperceptibly. The amused detachment drained out of it, leaving something colder and older beneath. "Yes," he said softly. "That is a motive people don't mention in polite society, because it sounds too like the truth." Parker said, "And Bellingham discovered something?" Mrs. Garrett nodded once, sharply. "He discovered the payments." "The private disbursements," said Whimsy. "Yes," said Mrs. Garrett. "Not for soup, not for coal, for things, for keeping people quiet, for making problems. Go away." Father Dimble said hoarsely, "What problems?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes flashed toward him. Don't ask me to say it in front of them, she snapped, and the them included not only the police but the dead man, as though Mr. Bellingham's open eye was still capable of moral judgment. Parker said, "You'll say it in front of a jury if you don't say it now." Mrs. Garrett's breath shuddered out. "There was a girl," she said. "Not one of ours, one of the women's daughters, a foolish girl. Sir Reginald took an interest. Then she began to talk. Mr. Harcourt dealt with it. Money was paid. She went away." Miss Tibbet made a little sound, appalled. "Away where?" Mrs. Garrett's voice turned hard. "To a place where girls go when they are inconvenient." Whimsy, almost absent-mindedly, quoted under his breath, "Et in Arcadia ego," and then added quite softly, "The trouble with inconvenient girls is that they have mothers." Mrs. Munn burst out, "It was to save the work, always to save the work. If it had come out, if the whole parish would have, there'd have been a scandal, and then who would feed them? Who would—" Parker's voice cut across her, and Bellingham threatened the papers. "Yes," said Mrs. Garrett, and now she sounded exhausted. "He said he would not be party. He said Father Dimble would be sorry if the papers ever got hold of it. Because it would ruin him too, ruin the parish, ruin everything." "And you," said Whimsy, gently cruel, "preferred a dead treasurer to a ruined parish." Mrs. Garrett's eyes blazed. "No," Parker said. "Then who did?" Silence again. Not the old silence of concealment, but a new silence, full of the shape of a person not present. Whimsy spoke into it, as though making a polite remark at a funeral. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, "or Sir Reginald himself, though I doubt he came in person. Because gentlemen who like control dislike risk. They send their hands, their keys, their little bottles of disinfectant." Parker's gaze was fixed on Mrs. Garrett. "Did Harcourt come today?" Mrs. Garrett's throat worked. "I don't know." Whimsy's voice was mild. "You do. You simply don't know whether saying it will destroy you." Mrs. Garrett's hands slipped off the chair back at last. She looked suddenly older, as though the effort of holding everything together had been the only thing keeping her upright. "He telephoned," she whispered. "About 11:50. He said Mr. Bellingham was making trouble. He said I must keep him quiet, keep him in the kitchen, keep him busy, keep him human." Whimsy nodded slowly. "Tea and kindness, the oldest trap in the world." Mrs. Garrett's voice broke. "I didn't kill him." Parker said, "Did Harcourt say he would come?" Mrs. Garrett shut her eyes. "He said he might have to. If Mr. Bellingham wouldn't see reason." Parker drew a long breath. "Right, Constable. Get me Marchbanks's address, and Harcourt's if he exists, and find out immediately whether anyone rang this place at 11:50. Whimsy added almost idly, "And to ring the telephone exchange, Charles. If Harcourt is careful, he will have chosen a call box, but careful men sometimes forget that rain leaves footprints." Parker looked at him. "Footprints." Whimsy's eyes went to the smear of wet grit by the mug. "Outside," he said softly. "The world is wet. Inside, someone brought in the street and tried to wipe it away with disinfectant." Mrs. Garrett, staring at the floor, whispered as if to herself, "He said it was for the work." Whimsy's tone was very gentle now, and very cold. "Yes," he said, "and the work, being innocent, becomes the perfect alibi for every sin committed in its name." Parker's men moved with the brisk economy of a well-drilled machine. Not the sentimental machine of fiction, but the real one. Boots, notebooks, careful fingers, and the irritating assumption that truth, like property, may be labeled and carried away. Mrs. Garrett's confession, if confession it was, had not produced the melodramatic collapse one reads about. It had produced, instead, that stubborn, dry-eyed endurance which English women reserve for funerals and bad harvests. She sat now, at last, on the chair she had gripped all morning, her hands folded tightly together as though holding something in that private clasp which nobody could seize and tag. Whimsy watched her for a moment, then turned away, not in mercy, but in that curious fastidiousness he had about other people's pain. He moved to the corridor and stood there, half in shadow, listening. From the church came a faint murmur. The verger pushed out again to his duties, a rustle of raincoats, the subdued, curious stir of people who have heard that something has happened in the rooms and are determined, by the very force of their propriety, to know what. Parker's voice inside the kitchen was clipped and practical. "We'll take the dispatch case," he was saying. "All correspondence, the accounts, the bottle, everything." "And the window catch," said Whimsy, stepping back in. "Do take the window catch, Charles, if you can manage it without pulling down St. Olave's. It's been persuaded to lie." Parker shot him a look that was half gratitude and half irritation. "Right," he said. "But photograph it, and the floor, and the mug." Dr. Langster cleared his throat again, his manner now slightly stiff, as though he wished to remind them that death was still, in the end, his domain. "Inspector," he said, "the body must be removed." "Yes," said Parker. Then more gently, "Yes, Doctor." They covered Mr. Bellingham with a sheet, and the kitchen altered at once. A body looks, when exposed, like a fact, when covered, like a secret. Miss Tibbet began to cry soundlessly, tears running down without sobs, as if her face had decided to leak and her pride had refused to make a noise. Whimsy, who had been watching the sheet settle, said softly to Parker, "That's the real reason they didn't want the police. A covered thing invites imagination. An uncovered thing invites evidence." Parker muttered, "For you can be damned poetic at inconvenient times." "One does what one can," said Whimsy. A constable appeared at the door with a battered parish telephone in his hand. "Inspector, call from the yard. They've got an address for Sir Reginald Marchbanks, Chelsea, and they're checking on a Gerald Harcourt. No record under that exact name, but there's a Gerald Harcourt alias connected with a firm in the city. They're—" The constable stopped, because Parker's face had changed. "What?" Parker snapped. "They say," the constable continued, "that Marchbanks has been out of town since Tuesday. Shooting party." Parker's jaw set. "So he's not your side door visitor?" Whimsy's eyes narrowed with interest, not surprise. "No," he said softly. "He's too fond of control to do his own errands." Parker turned on Mrs. Garrett. "Who told you he was out of town?" Mrs. Garrett's mouth tightened. "Mr. Harcourt. He telephoned yesterday. About letters." "And you believed him?" Parker said. "I had to," she replied, and the flatness of it was worse than anger. "If you take money from a man, Inspector, you believe whatever he tells you. That is the price. That is how it works." Whimsy's expression altered again. Briefly, a shadow of something weary and savage passed behind the polite mask. "Yes," he said. "And then one day the bill arrives." Parker said, "We'll put out a pickup on Harcourt. If he's real, he'll bolt." "If he's clever," said Whimsy, "he won't bolt. He'll vanish into respectability. He will be seen buying cigarettes at a shop, tipping a porter, reading a paper, anything to look like a man with no need to vanish." Parker stared at him. "And if he's very clever, then," said Whimsy, "he will come back." Mrs. Munn looked up sharply, fear breaking through her outrage. "Come back," she echoed. Whimsy glanced at the sheeted body. "Yes," he said, "to see whether his work has been tidied properly." Parker swore. "Get officers on the side door and the street. Quietly. No uniforms if you can help it. I don't want him spooked." The constable nodded and went. For a moment, the kitchen was full of that busy silence in which people avoid looking at one another. Then Parker said abruptly, "Peter, what are you thinking?" Whimsy took out his cigarette case, found it empty, and put it away with the air of a man who has discovered that even his vices have been confiscated by circumstances. "I'm thinking," he said, "about Mr. Bellingham and his dislike of sugar." Parker's eyes narrowed. "For God's sake." No, said Whimsy mildly. "Hear me out. A man who won't take sugar can't be poisoned in the usual sloppy way. It means the poison, if poison, was in the tea itself, or in the milk, or on the rim of the mug, or in something he touched before he drank." Parker's face hardened. The pencil. Whimsy's smile was thin. The pencil, or the papers, or a handshake, or the disinfectant itself. Something caustic, something that would burn, something that would make you want to open a window at once because the air has turned nasty. Dr. Langster said slowly, "If a corrosive substance—" "Yes," said Whimsy, "or some modern chemical, but I am not a chemist, and I refuse to play one in a kitchen. What I am willing to say is this. The window was opened, not for smell of death, but for smell of something alive, something sharp." Parker nodded once. "And the filed catch makes the opening deniable." "Exactly," said Whimsy. "A small preparation made long ago. That means the person who filed it had been using this kitchen for purposes that required ventilation without witnesses." Mrs. Garrett's voice came very low from her chair. He never... Whimsy turned to her. "Mrs. Garrett," he said gently, "I don't doubt that you told yourself you were protecting children from hunger, but you were also protecting a man's habits. And habits," he added with quiet precision, "are the most patient murderers in the world." Parker said, "We'll go to Marchbanks. Even if he's out of town, his housekeeper will know Harcourt." "And the shooting party," said Whimsy. "Do verify it. Men like Marchbanks are often out of town in precisely the way one's conscience is out of town, useful and not to be reached." Parker gave him a grim look. "You're coming?" Whimsy nodded. "Yes, but first, if you will permit one last piece of theatre." He walked to the kitchen door and opened it a fraction. The corridor beyond was empty now. The children had been herded away. The parish had been politely blocked. It was quiet enough that one could hear the rain making up its mind against the glass. Whimsy raised his voice. Not shouting, merely speaking as a man speaks when he expects to be overheard. "Mr. Harcourt," he said pleasantly, "if you are still in the building, you may as well go now. The side door squeaks." He waited. Nothing moved. Then, from somewhere, very faintly, came a sound. Not the squeak of the side door, but a soft, controlled exhalation, like a laugh swallowed in the throat. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "There," he said softly to Parker. "He's close enough to appreciate humor, and that, Charles, is the most dangerous kind of criminal. One who enjoys the performance." Parker's hand went to his pocket where his whistle lay. Whimsy touched his sleeve lightly. "Not yet," he said. "If we rush, we'll catch a coat and lose a mind." Parker hesitated, then nodded, tight-lipped. And so they waited, in a parish kitchen that smelled of tea and disinfectant and the unspoken bargains of respectable people, while somewhere in the walls, or the corridor, or the very idea of St. Olave's, a careful man with a borrowed name decided whether to run, to hide, or to return and tidy up the one thing he could not afford to leave untidy. The story.